Right, welcome to the session today, everybody. We're here to talk about Meta's data sharing restrictions and how this may lead to signal loss. So what are we talking about? So Meta announced late last year that depending on the line of business the advertisers are in, such as healthcare, finance, wellness products, things of that sort, that certain restrictions and certain categories of restrictions will be placed on how they share data with Meta business tools for advertising, tracking, and measurement, and all of that. Needless to say, amongst our healthcare customers, this has caused a major concern. We've been receiving questions on it endlessly, basically. But are organizations, as concerned as they are they concerned enough? So what caused these restrictions to come about? And where are they headed? We'll find out in today's session. I'm Nirmal Vemana. I'm the Principal Product Specialist for Healthcare and Life Sciences here at Telium. Been with the company for 3 years. I oversee our Healthcare and Life Sciences product and practice. And we have two wonderful speakers from our partner, Wheelhouse DMG. I will let them introduce introduce themselves. I'll start with you, Carissa.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carissa Vega, and I lead the digital advertising team at Wheelhouse. Been managing client campaigns and strategy in digital for over 20 years. And so been through quite a few platforms going up and down and restriction changes. But this meta shift is definitely one to note. It's probably one of the most significant that we've seen in the last 10 years as far as privacy first.
Hi,
Awesome. Thanks,
everyone.
Carissa. Cass. Oh, go ahead, Cass.
I'm so sorry for jumping in there. I just got excited. Hi, everyone. I'm Cass. I am a digital advertising strategist at Wheelhouse DMG. I primarily oversee the strategy and testing opportunities for our clients. I've been in marketing for almost 7 years now and specializing in healthcare marketing within the past 3 or so while with Wheelhouse. So I'm really excited to dig in today and talk more about the meta restrictions.
Fantastic. We'll dive in. Okay, let's start with the background. So what caused Meta to place these restrictions? I mean, if you think about it, healthcare organizations, they must be HIPAA compliant. So they have an imperative to not share sensitive data in the first place with advertisers like Meta. Having said that, what is causing Meta? What's the impetus for them to do it? And what types of restrictions are they placing upon advertisers? And where do we honestly see this going?
Yeah, so I would say they're following up, and we're seeing it's not just Meta, but the industry following up from the FTC's major enforcement of privacy actions between 2023 and 2024. So, we're talking big fines, right? There were big cases during that time, like GoodRx and BetterHelp, where they were sharing their data with their advertising platforms and maybe not realizing that they weren't compliant, right? And so Meta basically over this time has said, we need to get ahead of this, right? I think that they've been in court and other places enough, and they kind of wanted to separate themselves to say, hey, health and wellness, we don't want to know what you're doing. We don't want to know who's on your site or what they're doing or what conversions you need to manage. You're going to have to figure that out on your own. We're no longer accountable. And so they had alerted us to major changes that it took place in January of 2025 of this year. So what they started to do was categorize any businesses into sensitive categories at different levels, health and wellness being one of the most restrictive. So the core issue, I think, as I stated, is that most companies don't realize that their analytics is maybe not HIPAA compliant, and therein lies the problem, is understanding how you're collecting, utilizing your first party, your tech stack, and how all that tracks together. So it was as simple as placing a pixel on your site could put you out of compliance, and that's where a lot of people were getting tripped up. So Meta wanted to make sure that they took responsibility a bit and said, no, you can't collect this data, and didn't leave it up to interpretation to the individual clients and partners.
Makes sense. So it's almost as if the approach is proactive rather than relying on health and wellness industries themselves to place these self-restrictions. Meta's taking action ahead of time and getting ahead of, maybe trying to avoid even more FTC fines and legal action, which sounds prudent to me,
Yes.
given everything that's been happening in the news.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Cass, anything to add there, or do you think Carissa covered everything?
Um, Yes, I think Carissa did a great job of kind of summarizing the overall impact across industries and how, your classification is going to be determined based on, different health sensitivities. I think one thing to add here too is your restriction level is not necessarily dependent on what you're trying to advertise. I think someone who's promoting, you know, cancer treatments and trying to get new patients in for their clinic are going to be flagged the same as someone who wants to promote a wellness app for, better mental health. So those categories are all the same. No one really gets to sort of slide by. It's
Mhm.
just dependent on if you're categorizing anything that could potentially expose health information on your site or app.
Got it. So, which means you could be a cancer treatment center, but depending on how you've set up your website, what conversion actions you are setting up for a visitor to engage with, you may be held to a different standard of restrictions. It's not like you are a cancer treatment center, so automatically, no data can be shared. That is not the takeaway here. Would you agree with that?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
I think if you wanted to get really tricky with it and kind of code your whole website and not specify any sort of treatment
Right.
possibilities,
Yeah.
you likely could bypass Meta's restriction classification. However, that's probably not really realistic for most of the, advertisers out there and businesses out there, just because it doesn't provide that great user experience. So, yes.
That makes sense. Let's talk geography here. Obviously, we're based in the US and we mainly, and I can only speak for myself, I mainly engage with our healthcare customers based in the US, regulated by HIPAA, which is, the privacy regulation, the gold standard when it comes to patient privacy in the US. But is the impact of this announcement and these restrictions localized to the US, or are you seeing organizations impacted by it globally? Either one of you.
Yeah, I think for this, we are seeing these implications take effect globally. So, as we were just talking about previously, your restrictions based on either the product or services you're advertising aren't necessarily impacted from one through the other within your current geography region. However, where we start to see different levels of restriction categories fall is based on where you are advertising geographically. So, for example, in the US, we might be able to still track some website
Mhm.
events. However, when we start to look in Europe, where they have more stringent data sharing policies under GDPR, we do see that we have less options available to us. So, if we were setting up a campaign here in the US, we could probably track a step further than a click and
Mhm.
analyze landing page views and performance around other actions on the site, whereas in Europe we would only be able to track a click. So anything that you want to take off the platform itself won't be shared back to Meta, and you will not be able to effectively optimize or see the performance from those types of events.
Got it. So going back to your earlier example, a cancer treatment center not advertising treatment. They simply have a landing page with educational information, for example. But even that page tracking may not be possible in Europe. Nothing beyond a
Correct.
click, really. Yeah, makes sense.
Correct. Yes.
Okay, so that's so obviously this is bigger than organizations have been thinking about. So everybody all over the world, they need to see these restrictions through the lens of maybe their local regulations and the regional regulations. So it's going to be impacting everybody widely. Okay.
Yes. Yeah,
Um,
your strategy will
mhm,
definitely be dependent based on where you're hoping to advertise. I know we have a client who does have their product available globally. So the strategies we were able to implement for our US sector were very different than what we could roll out for the United Kingdom, for example. And it impacted how we were going to track events going forward.
understood. Carissa, anything to add there?
No, Cass pretty much covered it. I think that we're going to see the US and globally, even though those restrictions have been a little different over time, start to have less differentiation and they're just
Mhm,
going to be restrictive is my future outlook. So I think that we're going to be adopting more of the EU side of things
mhm.
to come in the US, which should, is going to be a big step.
Makes sense. So one thing that I'm particularly concerned about is how this impacts or could impact life sciences manufacturers, medical devices, pharmaceutical companies. At Helium, we do heavy work with both sectors of healthcare life sciences, both the manufacturers and the provider payer side of the house. Um, at the beginning, it wasn't clear, at least it wasn't very clearly spelled out, that life sciences manufacturers would be impacted by this. But I was under the impression, I had even been warning some of our life sciences customers that this may be coming down the pike for them. Has there been any measurable impact to life sciences manufacturers? It wasn't happening last year, but are you seeing any manufacturers you're speaking to being affected by this?
There are a few that we're watching. So and it does again depend on how they're classified by Meta, which I would argue we're not seeing it be cohesive across the board in some cases. I think that Meta has a lot of cleanup to work to do over this year, and they'll probably, in my expectation, expand what health and wellness means. So I would agree with you, Nirmala, that they need to keep watching this. Where it gets tricky is if you're a life sciences manufacturer and you're not just a B2B business or an HCP targeted business, but consumers can also purchase from you.
Yeah.
And so that designation is likely the most dangerous here and kind of what we're starting to see in some of the restrictions. I will say that and to back this up, so January was just the beginning for Meta. So we had a second wave of restrictions that was just announced probably 2 or 3 days ago that's going to roll out in September. And this one is specifically much more aggressive in that before, and I think we'll talk a little bit about our tactical approach, but before, we could no longer track direct conversions on a site. So a thank you page on the lead form that would indicate that, they've signed up or
Yes.
have a designation or bought a product for something very specific. So think about if you have arthritis and you make a relief pillow, you could be designating that, that person has arthritis, and Meta is saying, I don't want to know that at all.
Right.
So we had to think upper funnel. Now these restrictions are basically restricting additional first party data from creating custom audiences that would indicate a health condition. So indicate is the big word there. So any custom conversions that we were working around or trying to build on the site by watching a video or user intent for health conditions are now completely off limits. So you have to wonder, if your life sciences manufacturers are dealing in one or two specific conditions, Meta does have the potential to come in and say, this is too on the nose, right? You deal in arthritis, you make a relief for that arthritis. We don't want to know. So we do have some medical device clients that I won't name due to confidentiality, but something as simple as landing page views, we are not able to do for them based on the conversion markers that they have. So it is going that direction. They should definitely sit up and take notice and kind of have a plan B on how they'll be tracking moving forward.
Got it. That's fascinating because recently with regulations, something called intent has been or was getting a lot of attention. In other words, you can't assume intent that somebody is seeking healthcare because they visited a treatment website run by a hospital, for example, or a specialty care clinic. But it looks like Meta is taking it one step further. They're not even concerned about intent. The mere fact that somebody landed on the site, they could be a student researcher, they could be somebody who's not seeking care for themselves. It could be an academic interest, nothing more. But even in those cases, Meta is still being very restrictive, it sounds like. Would you agree with that?
I would totally agree because I think first and foremost, their job is to protect themselves legally from this, right? And so it's not necessarily, and there's been lots of arguments about it, it's not necessarily with their customers in mind. This is to protect, the first party data and their accountability.
All right, that makes sense. Awesome. So let's talk strategies, maybe even tactics. Like how could organizations face the ground reality? What protective measures can they take, or even what reactive measures must they take to bypass, maybe not bypass, but to respond to these restrictions without completely losing the ability to track and analyze visitor behavior. Whichever one of you wants to go first, feel free.
Yeah, I can jump in here. I think the strategy now, given the latest update from Meta, looks a lot different than maybe the strategy people were rolling out earlier this year when we first saw, these restrictions come into play. I know, the beginning of the year, everyone who's especially has a big focus on, the bottom of the funnel, wants to drive leads and conversion, was nervous coming into it, knowing that those events are going to be taken away from them come mid-February. So lots of people were looking not for ways to bypass necessarily, but definitely for ways to continue to track the conversions that matter most to them within Meta platform themselves, because we do know Meta is a large, marketing tool. People rely on it a lot. I'm sure it's within almost everyone's marketing mix. So having to adapt to these changes was definitely hard and impact audiences at the beginning, not just events. So I know for us and some of our accounts, the very first thing we did when we heard this news break last November was determine what can we start to shift into while trying to keep, our clients' goals top of mind. So for us, it was having to shift up a little bit into some of those awareness platforms. We would run different, video view campaigns or ad recall campaigns and create audiences in platform off of those to use for retargeting later down the line. And then in terms of looking at what events we wanted to track, rather than measuring the form directly on the site, we created custom events and market and optimized campaigns for view content events within the campaigns themselves. We tested various different objective types. I think the key here is you just have to keep testing and trying, new objectives, new optimization goals, and seeing what's driving the results that you were seeing before these changes came into effect. So for us, we created view content events off of the URL that would display after someone submitted a form. And then we're tracking that as a conversion because we could, reasonably say that this is very one-to-one here in this manner. However, now that Meta is rolling out these newer restrictions against these custom events, all different organizations might not be able to take that same approach anymore.
Gotcha.
I think one thing that does stand out for us too is even before Meta started releasing these data restrictions and updates, we have always had such a focus on ensuring our data was HIPAA compliant and have been transitioning from client-side tracking to server-side tracking. And I think for us, as Meta rolls out these new event restrictions and updates, the fact that we are using server-side tracking and can sort of filter the data that is shared back with Meta will help us avoid being flagged in that platform so we can continue to use our view content events the way that we have been without necessarily having to readjust our strategy come September when these new regulations go into effect.
Makes sense. So you're trying to help them with implementations in a way where they don't need to keep revising their strategy. You're making it maybe even top of funnel or close enough, but not too close to middle funnel, whereby they don't have to again pivot and then affect their own tracking by having to change the strategy or the goals of the campaign yet again. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think anytime you face a restriction, you start to think like, what am I going to do next month? And like, where could this possibly go in the next year and plan further down the line, which is what we've been doing with most of our clients on our side.
Yep, that makes sense to me. Carissa, anything to add there?
I would just say one of the things that we also looked at was budget diversification. So as things get harder and harder, it kind of forced us to be looking outside of Meta. So there was the problem of just fixing Meta and making sure that we were still stable there, but also are there other platforms where our audiences where we could now expand into? And if you think about it, Google, TikTok, a lot of those platforms are becoming more popular even in the health community within a compliant way. and they don't have these levels of restrictions yet to the level that Meta does. So there were some areas for us to start expanding and testing. We love the test, as Cass said, and we saw some great success with kind of expanding there as well and watching Meta and making sure that, it was providing the same level of value.
Makes sense. So in other words, be ready to experiment, but don't get too greedy, don't get too specific just because something is not restricted today. If you suspect it might be, might as well act like it will be in the future. That way you're not, losing campaign effectiveness as things start to taper off on the Meta side.
Yeah.
Okay.
That is some advice I would definitely
Mhm.
leave. I agree with you there. I think that this is going to be a rolling out. Meta is
Yeah.
just the first one doing this, but I think the next 5 years is going to be very challenging for many of the platforms. They could very well adopt this if they see that it works for Meta in a kind of limited liability sense. So it'll be quite a challenge for marketers and clients to be coming up with strategies and also staying ahead, making sure that they've captured their first party audience and they have a
Mhm.
good idea of who their audience is going to be key.
Got it. For customers who are looking at this, they are feeling anxiety. Maybe they haven't been impacted by this yet, but they have a feeling they will be soon. What advice would you give them? What mindset could they follow? Should they wait to take action or should they dive right in? Any
Mhm.
words of wisdom there to share?
I think Cass and I would agree, don't panic,
Hmm.
but don't wait either. When you
Mm.
see these drop or after you're reviewing this content, I think that it's important to kind of go and adopt that proactive mindset because a reactive one is going to put you behind, right? So we're telling clients regularly to kind of audit their Meta account categorization, seeing if you've been flagged, talk about it with your current digital partner and partners to kind of understand what their plans are ahead of time. Um, and as I said, the categorization process hasn't been perfect. So it's possible that you weren't caught in that first sweeping categorization and you could be in the future. So I think that there is an appeal process, but it's much better to kind of catch the issues and deal with it early because you're going to have to go through that appeal process if you feel that it's warranted, and that takes time. Um, the other thing I would say Wheelhouse really learned was that it actually was a positive. It really helped us kind of innovate rather than just react.
Mhm.
And so we're seeing our brands that were affected succeed right now, in some cases having their best cost per lead ever because we took the chance to target mid to upper funnel in some of our strategies and new platforms where we diversified our budget a little bit and increased our audiences where we didn't think maybe they were, but we took a chance and tested into that. And I think many agencies are always about in working with their clients, and the clients want the bottom line, right? I want my total leads, I want my conversion, I want my cost per lead. And so sometimes we need to think about this as more of a higher level, even more than we have in the past.
Mhm.
Filling that funnel is going to be so important, and then collecting that first party data in unique ways.
I mean, that sounds good to me. Cass, anything to add there?
No, I was going to just say the same sentiments. I don't think this necessarily has to be a negative, even if
Hmm.
you are impacted. I think for us, headed into this, we had some clients where they were driving 60% of their total lead volume on Meta. So this really allowed us to kind of take a step back and reframe how we want to look at our marketing mix. To Carissa's point, I think one of our largest strategies was not only just seeing how we can optimize Meta and like roll with these restrictions, but also looking at what other platforms can we grow into. We started to test into new platforms like TikTok, and we were even able to scale our performance on Google to new heights. So I don't think that the restrictions necessarily pose, you know, a negative here. I think it's just a challenge that actually helps you kind of take a step back and look to see how else you can continue to improve your current efforts. I think a lot of times you can get very complacent, like you found something that works really well. You don't want to touch it, you don't want to mess with it.
Right.
You want to keep driving the performance you've grown used to. And I know when this change happened, we did see our CPLs take a hit. Everything cost more. The performance at first wasn't great, but just through testing and reiterating on what we see work, especially since we do have access to that first party data to tie back to our campaigns, we were able to effectively improve performance to even better than what we were seeing before the restrictions came into play, just after diversifying our mix across other platforms and, looking to see what else we can continue to do. So I think it's part of the job, right? In marketing, you're always rolling with the punches. It's always changing. It's always different. You're always facing a new hurdle, and that can be really exciting. I think that's why we're all in this field, because there's some sort of excitement that comes from it. And I think once you test something and find something that works really well, it's so rewarding. So I think, there's a lot of positives to it also.
Awesome. I would agree. I feel like this wouldn't be the first time healthcare marketers have had to pivot over the years, over the decades. It's a long-term strategy, really, and these things are bound to come up every now and then. Awesome. We'll end on that note. Hopefully, this helps you not panic, healthcare marketers out there. If you're thinking about this, if you are not compliant yet, if you haven't been impacted by this yet, hopefully you learned tips and strategies here on how to tackle it. Thank you so much, Carissa and Cass. See you later. Bye. Cheers.
Thank